Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us from around the world today. Welcome to what will be a terrific conversation. And we hope this will provide some insightful conversation and perhaps a different way at looking at an end-to-end testing strategy. First, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest today, Mr. Zohar Liran. Zohar is the head of engineering data delivery and common workflows at Autodesk Construction Solutions, which is a business division of Autodesk. You know, Zohar and I have worked together for close to 2 years now, and I've learned a tremendous amount from him and the way he thinks about testing. Welcome, Zohar. Hi, how you doing?
Pretty good. Good to be here. Thank you, Tom.
Awesome. My name is Tom Holmes. I work with Autodesk to help facilitate the role BrowserStack plays in their quality journey. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with and get to know not only Zohar, but the entire Autodesk team. So, all right, a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's session will run for about 45 minutes. We are going to mute all the participants today, but I'm sure questions will come up specific to Zohar or BrowserStack in general. We'll dedicate 5 minutes or so at the end of this presentation. So if you could put your questions into the Zoom Q&A window, we'll do our best to try and answer them live. If not, we'll certainly circle back around and get back to you post this webinar. The session is also being recorded, and we will provide the recording to all the attendees and make it available for you after today's event. Fantastic. Let's have a look at the agenda. You know, we're constantly curious how the most innovative and influential companies approach testing and what their testing philosophy is. And we know no company is immune to challenges. So we're excited to dig into the challenges that Autodesk faces, but also look at some of the solutions and overall benefit. We'll then hone in a little on visual testing, learning how Zohar and his team are achieving, or at least trying to achieve visual excellence. Then I'd like to briefly show you our vision at BrowserStack, what our long-term vision is here, how we're trying to solve and attack some of the issues and the inefficiencies within the testing landscape. And then finally, we'll move into the Q&A. Before we dive into today's discussion, let's kick this things off with a quick poll. We'd like to know how you're validating your application's functional and visual elements. So there should be a code that's popped up on your screen there, so you can cast your vote. I'm going to give it about 30 to 40 seconds, and then we'll jump right into our scheduled agenda. All right. All right, looking at these, Zohar, I'm not sure if you can see the results here. Yeah, so, you know, it looks like majority are using automation tools exclusively for functional testing and manual testing visual elements. There's a few folks that are automating the whole suite, so functional and visual tests, and then a smaller percentage are still in the manual sort of validations size for functional and visual tests. How does this sort of, what sticks out to you here? Is this sort of in line with what you would see?
This is very interesting, because to me it indicates the phase in the transition which we are today, right? Where people have realized that actually automation is the way to go. So the first line of defense, if you will, is automating the tests themselves, and then the second would be doing the visual. But the interesting thing is, once we understood that there are tools like Percy, for example, that offer this capability, the added cost, if you will, to go from just the functional automation to the visual automation is almost nothing, because the tool provides us so much value. And then to go from there to then have everything fully automated and a complete guarantee of essentially basically deploying to production with a complete assurance of everything not only works well but looks well, that to me was the highest value. So I'm glad to see that teams and people are moving to full automation, but it's interesting. Perhaps that's good that we have webinars like this to provide that added
Yeah,
education.
absolutely. Does it surprise you, and perhaps from your own experience at Autodesk, does it surprise you that there are, and you've mentioned this to me in the past, there are folks that are doing manual testing on both, and I know not everything can be automated, but there are core groups that are manual testing for both functional and visual tests. Is there a sort of an appetite for organizations holistically to improve their or mature their automation, would you say?
It's I think it's interesting because it's a philosophical paradigm shift of people that have engineering and QA separate, and they live in their own worlds,
Right.
and they do this. And some teams have better communication between the two, and they work well together. But still, the concept of having a separate person testing what another person built is a very interesting approach. But what I do see, and we're obviously, as you saw in what you read in my title, data delivery is one of the groups. So we're very data driven. And we definitely see teams that have completely adopted the approach of automating this process, have experienced less incidents, less bugs released to production, because they don't need to worry about these things. And the pressure on the QA teams, right? There's only so much. For every little change, you have to then not only test the change, but did that change impact other places in the application, right? So if you have a test suite that just runs 1,000 tests in 5 minutes, just keep releasing, right? As much as you want.
Yeah.
That alone, I think that power, like I mentioned earlier, that assurance level of releasing to production is very valuable. And teams that I do talk to that are still early in the game that have that manual QA process are slowly starting to convert, if you will.
Yeah.
Again, because
Absolutely.
the data supports that.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for participating in that. Thank you for your insights, Zohar. And before we sort of start that, I was hoping, Zohar, and I know I gave you a brief introduction, but perhaps you could give us a more of an overview of what your role is there there within your COE and obviously within the data engineering delivery group.
Yeah, of course. So for those, just to give a kind of a broader picture, for those who don't know, what we do in the Autodesk Construction Solution division is essentially build software for the large construction space. So you would think airports, hospitals, stadium, big projects. And all these projects are managed by software. What my groups in what the internal structure that we have is called COE. So the groups that exist within my COE are everything that has to do with the two groups of data delivery, like Tom mentioned, which is all the data that's being produced by all of the teams across the entire division. If it's checklist issues, meetings, all this data that's being fed back into the system is now being taken back into a big data lake that we created, and then the data delivery build a platform on top of it, which different teams can create reports, dashboards, extractions of the data into our customers' systems, and more tools in order to, again, have access to data in different ways. And these different ways serve as different functions within the construction project lifecycle. So that's one group. And then the other group that has several teams within it, such as issues, locations, notifications, and another group that does some coordination of a larger format to the rest of the construction industry. So those teams are, again, tools that are used across many sections of many services within our organization, specifically issues, but again, also location notifications, because that's what's obviously notification used by every service to send notification to customers. Issues is a very important thing because it's a part of the construction project lifecycle where people in the field actually need to constantly improve things that are happening and tag issues that are happening as the project is being executed. And location, of course, construction projects are obviously a physical place, and location creates the software representation of the physical location breakdown, right? So you can think of building 1, floor 2, section 3,
Yeah.
room 24.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for that. And yeah, I should have done that previously, but I thought it'd be good to get a holistic view of the Autodesk business. So appreciate that. You know, in an era of increasingly complex software development and the need, and it seems the consistent need for quicker releases, the significance of end-to-end testing has what we've seen has never been more pronounced. So Zohar, how are you currently solving for end-to-end testing at Autodesk?
Yeah. So we have a few flavors running, again, across different teams. Some of them still use manual QA, as I mentioned. Some of them have a combination of the two. And then some of my teams, we try to just automate everything that's possible to automate, because those are things that build on top of each other. And as you release more features, you can test more things, and the whole suite is being ran and everything is being tested. So that way you make sure that nothing you changed here impacts anything here, and you're releasing with confidence. Now, the main idea, other than, of course, making sure that nothing broke or no bug is presented or nothing got moved as in a visual aspect, in addition to that, we have official support for several platforms and several browsers. So as everybody knows, there are also differences as you release into different browsers. That also is very helpful when we're able to run Percy and tell it, hey, run it through against these browsers and these versions in both Mac OS and Windows, which then kind of catches all of the officially supported ones across our user base, which allows us to, again, not have a manual repetitive process of, okay, check it here and check it here and check it here, but rather just click, run the test or a part of our deploy, a CI/CD pipeline, make sure that the suite is ran. As long as everything comes back green, we're good to go. That,
Awesome.
in addition to mobile applications, which we're also working with you, Tom, on a new product that you guys are going to release, and that's going to be another interesting thing of allowing, as probably some people here know, that building tests on mobile is slightly different than doing it on web. So there are different solutions of recording tests as opposed to writing them in code, and those are kind of interesting development that are happening in this ecosystem.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Could you share some insights on your setup and how you sort of manage automation, how you determine device coverage, integrations, and then obviously sort of bug resolution, how that process works? Could you share some insights on that?
Yeah, of course. So we have automated tests that run as part of our PR checks. Because we can utilize BrowserStack's infrastructure to run all the parallel tests, that those tests are fairly fast because we can run a lot of tests in parallel. We utilize a lot of usable components, things like, probably a lot of people understand things like login and the things that are used in any flow. And that helps us create tests in a fairly fast manner. So then once those tests are created, they're placed in our test suite. The test suite is run automatically as part of our Git checks. And unless that check comes back green, the PR cannot be merged. Once that check comes back green, and when I say green, it means that the end-to-end together with visual both pass across all the browsers that we officially support. Once that comes back green, only then a PR could be merged, and only once it's merged, CI/CD pipeline will deploy it into our different environment. And after every environment deployment, we will have a suite that runs against that environment that makes sure that everything in that environment runs as expected as well.
Okay. That's,
now that
and then
is
in terms of, sorry,
just to add, that's true for applications that we run, we also have what we call as component libraries, which we use Storybook, which has the integration with Percy, that again, the added cost that we have to run those tests or write these tests is basically zero, because all we tell Percy is take this Storybook stories and just run it as tests. And that allows the system to visually make sure that no component has changed, considering the fact that there's a lot of compositions within those component libraries, right? You use one component and that's a part of another component, which is a part of a bigger chart, and so on. So those things allow us to make sure that every time we make a change, everything else stays the same visually.
Yeah.
So that's also a part of the kind of CI/CD pipeline of that component library.
Yeah, awesome. And then in terms of coverage, how does your team or the teams that you interact with, how is coverage determined, and how do you go about knowing what to validate your applications on?
Yeah, so there are a few things. So there's coverage in the hard sense, right? Where if you run unit test and you have a specific percentage of coverage, we found that as good as that metric is, it's very fungible, because the fact that the test actually runs through certain lines or certain code doesn't mean that, number one, it tests what you want it to test, and number two, it's not necessarily the best test. So these are things that obviously we as engineers have to make sure and always be on top of. So that number is something that we always set as a benchmark and always try to bring up as opposed to down. So if you add new code, of course, you always cover that. So that's the coverage in the hard sense of the word. But for at least the products that we have here, the coverage that we use, we created, for lack of a better term, a spreadsheet, if you will, right? That kind of maps out creates a map of our product and the different flows that exist in the product. And that creates a metrics across the different users with different permissions, because that's also an important thing to make sure that, screen A could look different for user X versus user Y. So those are things that we created in that spreadsheet. And we then make sure that all the accounts across the permissioned users, across the different screens, are all covered. And that's how we make sure that our coverage is appropriate for the service. And maybe that's an interesting, it just came to me as we were discussing, it's an interesting product proposal for BrowserStack to create an actual product map, right? So people can kind of make sure that the coverage is proper.
Coverage is right. Yeah, absolutely. I'll fly that up the flagpole. Obviously, there was, you've been a partner of ours for a few years now. It'd be interesting to understand the methods or the tools that you used before leveraging BrowserStack, and sort of understand, the decisions or the conversations that made you migrate to BrowserStack. Would you be able to talk about sort of before, during, and after that sort of transition?
Yeah, so this was actually a very interesting transition. We were in the Sauce Lab part of the world, right, which is a competitor of BrowserStack. And the reason, I think the reason we transitioned was, it had a few factors. Number one, if we take the story back to how we even started, was we looked for a product that does visual testing properly, right? Back in the day, before BrowserStack even acquired Percy, and before SauceLab acquired Screener, there were several like Apply tools, Percy, Screener, and a few others. The interesting thing was that Percy was in early stages. It looked very promising, but it was very early stages at that time. Screener was doing pretty well, but the caveat there is that Screener, in order to run in parallel, had its own DSL, which really got you kind of locked into that specific vendor, if you will.
Right.
And as we were maturing in our testing suite and capabilities and how we thought about it, we constantly looked for ways to innovate in that field, because we wanted to make sure that we have essentially a robust and reliable enough test suite that we can tweak and run as we would like, in order to make sure that our level of assurance when we release is very, very high. Now, as people are aware, throughout this history, along came the tool called Cypress, which was very, very well supported, very well managed. It worked really fast. So it was a very good tool that really made us think about our testing suite and should we transition. Now, SaltLab didn't have the support for Cypress, and the idea that Cypress is an open source tool that we can then leverage and utilize as we wish was a very powerful value proposition. Now, the second factor here that came into play as we were looking around to think, okay, if we want to use Cypress, but SaltLab doesn't have, then we need to look outside. And when I think that's somehow kind of right along the time that you and I met.
We connected, yeah.
Yeah. The second factor that I think was very, very powerful was the level of support that we got from BrowserStack. So to have one main point of contact that knows our account and knows the tools that we use and knows our services, and then by you being able to pull the right technical person every time to have a very direct conversation about what are the things that we had. And as we evaluated the tools, it was a very interesting experience to actually sit with some of your technical team and bring up points that we thought, hey, these are things that we see as a problem. And as your technical team actually walked us through certain things they had just a different way of thinking about the approach to testing or the approach to monitor testing, we realized, oh, actually, that's a good point. We never thought about looking at tests this way. And we realized, oh, the point that we actually thought was a problem is actually a strength. So it made us kind of be happy to adopt the tool. And of course, as we put it into the test, we realized that these are metrics that I actually got yesterday, we've seen a pretty significant speed up in our test run. So average test run went from, I think, 3 minutes to 30 seconds to about 1 minute, which was pretty significant. Again, this is early stages, so these numbers could be taken with a grain of salt, but if it's not 300%, even if it's 50%, that's already a significant test, because we run thousands of tests a day across several teams in different geos. And all of that is obviously a delay that each team has to deploy and to release their product, if it's a hotfix or anything. So having the test suite not even being the longest part of your pipeline is an incredible, number one, an incredible achievement. And number two, it gives our engineers a very sympathetic look on the whole concept of tests, because they never look at that specific part of the pipeline as, oh, now tests have to run. No, it's like, oh, that's just that's just a minute or two. So that I think was a very powerful. So of course, for us, it was the tools, the ability to use open source, and the technical support, and of course the ease of use and ease of integration. We've tried to do some of the stuff. I mean, we've done some of the stuff ourselves, but every time, I try to get the team to like, hey, let's work with the BrowserStack folks. And a lot of the things were pretty self-explanatory, and the things that were not, we actually sat with the team and say, hey, this could be explained better, and changes were or suggestions were very well accepted. So I thought that type of partnership is a partnership that we like to see with our vendors, because these are the partnerships that we do with our customers, right? It's always something to get both sides improved.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. Yeah, that's very insightful. As we sort of shift the conversation naturally over to sort of Percy and striving to achieve visual excellence, I was hoping you could sort of walk us through, how you're solving for visual regression. I know you've touched on it slightly, but particularly within your team, perhaps we can go a little deeper there. Obviously, the tools that you're using, not only Percy, but some of the other tools for this purpose. And then perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, show some usage cases where these tools have been particularly effective.
Yeah, of course. So I can actually share my screen. Do you want
Oh,
to
great.
share the tool? Because we've just opened up. So 2 examples of Percy. As I mentioned earlier, Percy, share this. So Percy is, this is not your BrowserStack real screen because I have a dark theme. So let's go to your original. There you go. Just to make sure I'm not twisting your tool. Okay. So Percy serves right now two main purposes for us in 2 different ways, right? So number one, of course, it's a visual testing tool, and the idea of a visual testing tool for us is the fact that something functionally works if you run it through automation doesn't necessarily mean that it looks the way you expect it to look. And that's why we think visual testing is very important, especially in things that are very visual. So we have a few examples, but example I have here is a dashboard that we use. So this is all just test data, right? But there's, as you can see, there's a lot of visual things here, from the layout of the dashboard in different resolutions. If people use it in tablets, there are different charts that people can have with our dummy data, and these are things that are important for us to make sure that they look well across browsers, across resolutions within the browser, to make sure that it's always exactly what we expect it to be. So this is a part of our end-to-end test. As we run our tests that we've already have for end-to-end that are functional, we just add one line that tells the test, okay, at this point of time at the test, just take a snapshot, and that gives us the ability to make sure that, you know, a function, a button is not hiding behind another div or something like that. Make sure that it's visible in the way that we need to be. So pixel to pixel comparison is important. And the other thing that's important for us is also the ability to block out things, to tell Percy, hey, this thing could change from a day to day or from a project. Just ignore it right now and don't even load it.
Right.
In this case, this doesn't necessarily change, but we don't want it to be loaded because it's a part of a map that we load. So we don't even need that to be in the test, because that's Google tests that for us. So that's a part of our functional end-to-end test. And then the second thing is our component library. So we have a component library with a lot of components in it. As you can see here, we have 327 snapshots here that are taken. So every time we make a change, we run and make sure that, as I mentioned before, composition of component is a very important thing, because you could change something here and that looks fine, but it actually broke in another component that you have. So all of these are base components that are a part of a component library that is used in different services, not just even our service. And as we release those versions, we really want to make sure that nothing's broken and people can keep creating charts. We can run all the permutations of different charts and different data sets. So that really helps us. Of course, different sizes, as you can see here. Let's see if there's another interesting, yeah, different sizes, different data sets. So those are important for us to test. Yeah, so these are basically the 2 main uses that we have for Percy.
Awesome.
You want me to go over anything else in this?
No, I think that's well covered. Obviously, if there's any specific questions, feel free to the audience here, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we'll be sure to drill down any further on that. But thank you for that. You know, as we sort of transition over sort of balancing speed and quality, and in the context of this rapid development cycle, how can organizations effectively balance the sort of fail fast strategy with the imperative of cultivating a fix fast culture?
Yeah, this is something that I think just the concept of failing fast, fixing fast, but even more than that is just a rapid release. If you
Hmm.
think of a mature company or a mature product, you have to take under consideration that you already have an established user base that is using your product for their day-to-day operation. In our specific use case, one mistake, one bug could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to projects that are out in the field. So we cannot be releasing bugs that cause people have or lose the ability to create a certain flow, right? We've had things like that happen in the past, and you can think, in different industries is different things, but specifically in the construction industry, if a certain person cannot take a certain action or see certain information that he needs to see, that could mean in one instance, right, that trucks were delayed or trucks need to arrive and can't arrive to a certain site, and because they didn't know about that specific action because a bug was introduced in the system, they didn't have a way to communicate between their parties, and that created days of delay, which is again hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Yeah.
just that little delay. So we need to be very, very careful about all these little things and every little flow. And that's the reason why I think automated QA as opposed to manual QA serves this specific purpose very well, because it could go through 1,000 permutations every time. You can release 3 times a week, and all these permutations would run on your service and make sure that every flow of every user of every type of account, right? You have different level, different dimensions in your metrics, right? You have different user permissions, you have different accounts styles, and you have different projects, or you have different entities. So all these flows need to be verified to a point that that whatever you release didn't impact any of the stuff that already existed. You're only releasing either a fix or a new feature. Now,
Yeah.
in addition to that, it also goes back to that philosophical idea of, if you're an engineer that writes a feature, writing a feature without writing a test for the feature is essentially as if you fix the car just under the hood, but you never actually try to start it and drive it, right? You don't know that you actually fixed it. There's no proof that you fixed it. And so that's in the qualitative sense, but also from a tactical sense. When engineer A comes to review a PR of engineer B, having a test as a part of that PR give the reviewing engineer a full picture of what is it that actually the PR is trying to do. It's written in code in a language that the engineer is supposed to understand. So I think that's also another added value to allow the review process to be faster, not only the actual execution. So some people came to me when I had these discussions with teams that still have that manual QA process and told me, well, it's nice that you have these things, but doesn't that mean that your development process is actually much longer, because now the test has to be written as part of the development process? And to that I say, it's actually not that, it doesn't add that much, because if you have a feature that took, let's say, 3 days to write, it doesn't take 3 days to write a test, because you already know what it's supposed to do. You just literally you tell commands, and most of the times everything in the command sequence that you have, if it's either a bug fix or even if it's a new feature, the lion's share of the test is mostly made of modules that you already have, right? Log in, go to this screen, right? Click that. It's only now you added a new feature, do this new thing, they just write this little portion of the test to do this new thing. So the addition is, maybe 10 to 20% is being generous of how much it adds as an overhead, but the level of assurance and the level of stability that your product has, and of course that translates to your bottom line with removing churn from users and user happiness, how much
Right.
user happy that you're not introducing bugs, you're fixing bugs a lot faster. I think that's just beyond justifies the cost.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It'd be interesting to understand, Zohar, sort of the strategic approach, Autodesk, and I know your point of view on this. and your teams and the philosophies you have. How is that viewed more widespread within Autodesk, perhaps in ACS, Autodesk Construction Solutions, but beyond that, is there a strategic approach, or what is the strategic approach that Autodesk is currently taking? And if there's any details on this sort of fail fast, fix fast mentality and strategies that are currently being executed, not only within your particular teams, but perhaps wider in the org too.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting conversation that's taking place right now, because so there's a few aspects to that. If you think about things that exist today with regards to quality, so quality today has probably the biggest emphasis, because we want to make sure, like I mentioned before, that we don't release anything that breaks stuff for our customers, right? That's a huge thing. Now, the concept of quality comes in basically two sides. Number one is when you released a bug, right? Or when there is an incident, or when something happens negative in your product, how much time it takes to resolve it, right? So the median time to resolution. But I think that the smarter thing is actually don't release anything bad in the first place. And the thing that helps you assure that the most is if you have a product test strategy. So we're taking we have two initiatives that are taking place right now. One is to make sure that anything that does happen, the time to resolve it is very short. And the other is, how do we even mitigate these things from happening? So we have all these processes to make sure that there is a resolution, there is a proper support, there are proper notifications and transparency with the customers. But the more important thing is, how do we even go to a preventative measure? So it's kind of like having heart disease, right? You can go and there are pills and you can take care of that, but there are ways to even prevent that in the first place if you eat right and exercise and all that stuff that we all know, right? So we try to eat our greens as much as possible, and
we do our best. Yeah.
Now that initiative is interesting because, as I mentioned before, it is a philosophical discussion. There are some teams that still have a quite sizable QA team, right? The people that do a lot of the manual work, and they are used to that flow and they're used to that process. But again, the data that we have to support the fact that once you start putting things in automation, your level and amount of problems are reduced is unquestionable. Now, the interesting thing is to take manual QA teams and tell them, okay, instead of manually QAing stuff, maybe start automating, like allocate some of the resources to start automate stuff, and just start small. You don't have to boil the entire ocean, right? So you start small with automating at least one flow or one piece, and then you build on top of that. So those are things that worked with our approach. We're talking to teams to say, you are way over here. We want to get you to fully automated way over here. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, awesome. Wow, there's a lot in there, Zohar, and it's really inspiring to hear about your journey. Like I said before, I've learned a lot over the last couple of years, and how you're expanding your testing efforts to sort of build out this mature end-to-end testing model. And I've said this, and this perfectly complements BrowserStack's sort of overreaching vision of a unified testing platform. So Zohar, bear with me. I know you've heard this before, but this is for the benefit of the audience. I'd like to give you a sort of a brief overview of BrowserStack before we jump into the QA. Yeah, so today's sort of testing landscape is sort of marked with fragmentation, right? There's a lot of inefficiencies. There's a lot of tools. People have preferences for their specific tools. There's a lot of manual process, and our vision at BrowserStack is pretty clear, right? What we aspire to be is an end-to-end testing platform and sort of the ultimate testing solution for the internet. And this it entails providing testers with a comprehensive solution across the testing cycle. So from the initial phases of development, where they can write the tests using powerful frameworks like Selenium, Nightwatch, Playwright, Cypress, to offering a sort of a low-code, no-code alternative for added flexibility. So our platform allows testers to run their tests on real devices, identifying both functional and visual bugs before they even reach production, which is what we've discussed and what you discussed, Zohar. And we've streamlined that entire testing process through a centralized test management system. And we offer to keep deep insights through test observability. So our vision is to be present at every stage of the testing lifecycle, whether it's web, app, accessibility, performance, and beyond. So this brings us to our next poll question. I'll leave it open for about 30 seconds here, and then I want to spend some time because we've got some great questions on the Q&A, Zohar. I'd love to just understand the interest from the audience here before we jump into these. Zohar, while we let that tick over, have you had a chance to review some of the questions here? If not, I can certainly talk about them.
Yeah, I'm reading them right now.
Yeah, I think they're and we can just go down the list here. We'll just give it a few more minutes here.
Yeah,
a few more
good
seconds.
questions. Definitely people who were looking into this, to the tech. It's
Yeah.
pretty good.
Awesome. We'll get into the questions. I think we'll start at the top as they came in. So, what kind of visual testing are you implementing? Is it snapshot testing?
Yes. Yeah, that's
Yep.
the visual testing we do.
Yeah. So Percy does take snapshots and provides diffs of the tool, and that's what of the application, and that's how Percy functions, and that's how Zohar's team is leveraging it. Another question here: when you said a PR can only be merged when you would have past status for your test, would you block a PR when a single test case fails, or is it a percentage of past tests that you look for?
Usually it's all of it, not just a percentage. If you are in a situation where you want to enable, if one test failed, that means that you have what we call test flakiness. You want to avoid test flakiness as much as possible, because that essentially reduces your level of assurance in your own test suite, which is kind of interesting because you could get false positive or false negatives, and it's and then you just get in a very rocky road in how utilizing it, because the whole idea of having a test suite, a robust test suite, is the fact that when you run it, you don't need to double check after it, because that was the whole point of automating it. So we try to really get to 100%. Now, I won't lie and say they all pass all the time, but we make sure that if there is flakiness, we essentially not just look into, oh, is this a bug in our software? But if it wasn't, we just ran it again and now it's green. We want to make sure, oh, why was it the first time we ran it was red? And what makes our test only pass some of the time and not all the time? And that's how we make sure that now the test has to be 100% green. And that's how we unblock the PR.
Awesome. Okay. Is it recording while testing? How would you get started, I suppose? How did you get started on this?
Yeah. So are you saying recording while you run an end-to-end test? Is that the question?
Yes, I think so. It's yeah.
So yes, and it does it in two ways. In our specific purpose or use case, we have the recording that BrowserStack creates of the test run itself. So on the platform you have a recording, and since we're using Cypress itself also allows you to, it's not even just a recorder, it's actually a rerun of the test with all the console messages, and you can go to a specific test in the browser. So they have a fairly sophisticated, but it's not always needed. What's really helpful that everything is being managed under the BrowserStack platform, and in the console of BrowserStack we can then replay if we see something flaky. And if we need for further debugging, if you really need to kind of dive deep, then the open source tool of Cypress allows you to do that full recording as well.
Awesome. It's another one that came in, perhaps a little bit more for me. If you record a visual test case for screen size, will Percy execute, evaluate, and pass fail against other screen sizes? I mean, you can answer that. Yes, it does. It does support different screen sizes, resolutions, browsers, and types of devices too. So, you know, I'm not sure how you're.
Yeah, I think it's in, maybe if I'm understanding this correctly. So when you run Percy, you tell it run against, you know, these browsers, these OS, these resolutions. And when you're comparing, you know, resolution A, it will only compare to your baseline of resolution A. It wouldn't fail if it's, you know, it's different than resolution B, because it will have to be different than resolution B.
Yeah.
So it will pass fail against the same resolution that it's running.
Resolution, yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Does BrowserStack test, and this is actually a conversation I've had with some teams at Autodesk, the visual aspects of desktop applications? Not at the moment. It's a web app, mobile app, native mobile app, and a web app tool. I know Autodesk, you have some desktop applications, and we've discussed that before. Unfortunately, not at this time. Yeah, and this sort of answers a few of those questions. Just moving on here, when we say testing the changes 3 times a week and validating all the flows, user permission combinations with varying test data, etc., this can be long hours running UI tests. How do we manage these execution time and retries and don't miss the timelines?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it touches the huge advantage we get from parallelizing tests, which we leverage BrowserStack infrastructure. So we don't have, in the past we needed to spin up all the stuff in our infrastructure, but and we also have teams that do some of that with other tools that they run. But since we use BrowserStack, we can literally say run in 50 parallels, and the test is fairly fast and it runs a lot of tests. So it will essentially, your entire suite will take as much as your longest single test will take. And if you have one test that takes a long time, maybe you can break it apart to 2, and then you can even get advantage from the parallel. So the idea is, when I mentioned testing changes 3 times, it's not testing changes 3 times. We're saying even if you release your application 3 times a week, which is fairly often, you know, if you continuously delivering new code, which is great in my opinion. If you're releasing that, each one of those releases, your suite runs, and that, you know, that adds fairly small overhead if you're running it in parallel, because you're enjoying that already made infrastructure and orchestration. Yeah.
There's a quick follow-up test to the screen sizes. Here's Zohar, the one where you had where we had the visual test for different screen sizes, and it's if we had to create a baseline against every screen resolution, devices, every application screen, this would require an entire team to create baseline. Can you pass on your suggestion for doing so?
Well, when you run today an automated test and you run it for the first time, your test will create that baseline automatically. So you could just review to make sure that all your baselines are correct one time, and you can click approve all, and that's it. At that point, you have a baseline. So you don't need to create that baseline. You just have to make sure that that's the baseline you want.
Yeah.
But it will be created automatically by running the test.
Yeah. There's a few good questions in here. Hopefully we can get a few more in. let's see. Okay, this is a good one. My team is in a transition from full manual testing into UI and API automation via Playwright. And we're having a hard time with the balance of supporting sprint work releases and team foundational growth that will enable us to operate with the peak agility we're looking to grow. Any advice on surviving the transition or ensuring that the team sees the value in stretching this far with minimal payoff at the present time?
Yeah, this is a very good question. We get it a lot actually when talking to teams, and this is a transition that a lot of teams are going through, and so you're not alone. First of all, it's important to say.
Yeah.
Now, the way that we've seen this works well with other teams is, first of all, be comfortable with the fact that you can't binary get from nothing to perfect, right? It will be a slow curve, and that curve could be allocate 1 or 2 people to build, to take some time to just be allocated to testing while the rest of the team is continuously working on your regular deliverables, and then have them build a very solid foundation and baseline components of the test suite in order to then enable a more rapid test building process for the rest of the team. So that's number one. Number two, from a certain moment in time, have the consensus and agreement across the team that everybody that writes any feature opens a PR that is accompanied with a test. So that way you know that from a certain point, your test suite is building up just by releasing features anyway. And then you'll have the part of the team that's allocated to build that foundational, strong foundation that is before that line. So then everything after that line, you know, that is utilizing these components, like I mentioned before, logging or logging, whatever it is. And in addition to that, you want to make sure that you're at the beginning of this whole process, you want to make sure that you're creating that matrix that I was talking about, where you understand what is your product, who are your users, what are the different configurations and permutations of permissions and user types and flows, all these things. If you have the right matrix, you can then check box as you go and make sure that you've reached at least your foundational or minimal coverage, that you know that all the types of users in all the types of accounts are then covered in these specific flows. And then once you have that ready and you have the foundational piece ready and you start that line of, from that point, everyone is writing a test when they have a feature, you can then allocate whatever every half of a Friday to write another test that covers this existing matrix of things that are not fully covered, and then slowly but surely you will get to that holy land of I have everything covered and everything will be covered from this point on. And that's it's not an easy, straightforward transition, but I think it's very worth it, because when you get to that point, like I said, you have a very, very strong level of assurance releasing, and that makes your release process better. It makes your apps more resilient, and it reduces the amounts of incidents and bugs that you're giving to your users.
Awesome. I think we got time for 2 more here, perhaps. Another one coming in regarding flakiness. With so much of your UI automated, how long does it take to run the tests? Do you run into issues with flakiness or brittleness, and how do you get around it?
Yeah, so the time to run the entire suite, actually, let me see, because I was just looking yesterday. Did I have this number here? So today, the time to run the entire suite was about an hour in the old one. It will be, again, because we're using parallelism, we'll go down to probably 10 minutes if I'm and I think even better since the parallelism is so powerful. So I'm assuming that we can finish a suite within probably less than 10 minutes.
Awesome.
And there was another part of the question. Oh, how do we handle brittleness? That's a good point. So I think, and that's, I touched on it a little bit. It's very important to treat your tests as a first-class citizen in your development focus, which means if a test is flaky or brittle, take time and work on that, because that will pay you dividends later. Because that means that your level of assurance in your suite is constantly high, because once it starts to erode, the whole effort is completely useless. So you want to make sure that tests are first-class citizens in the development cycle, that if something is brittle, you treat it as well as almost as important as there's a bug in the system, because as you release, that means that you can't rely on the test to test it. You have to manually test it, and that's an added time, and you have to do it every time. So treating that, understanding why it is, and I've had the good experience with Tom's technical team. Every time there's any brittleness that we didn't understand why it happens, to go with BrowserStack and talk to them. They have a lot of experience with obviously with testing, because that's the bread and butter. And understand, is it something that we're not doing right on our side, or is it something that we're not configuring the BrowserStack runtime properly? So those little details are very important to get right.
Awesome. All right, last one here. When mentioning running in parallel and utilizing BrowserStack's infrastructure, what does that mean for the Autodesk backend the client tests are running against? Do you deploy copies of your backend for each parallel test stack?
No, this basically means, so you can think of every test as a user logging in and doing a certain flow, right? Your app is there to serve millions of users. So this is basically we clicking one button and tell the BrowserStack infrastructure, go run 60 users with 5 permutations, right? So these are 300 tests. So that basically means that it's equivalent to 300 users logging into your systems and doing different things. But your system is just one system, right?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, I know we've got a few unanswered ones here, and we'll certainly get back. But in the effort to stay on time here, we'll wrap it up. I know we've got 2 minutes. Zohar, fantastic talking to you and understanding the way you think about testing. It's inspiring. It's very informational. Really appreciate your time today. And obviously we'll be speaking throughout the week. And to the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope it was insightful for you all. We're going to get round to the questions that we were unable to answer. We will also share the recording so you can review anything that you perhaps missed, and perhaps more questions will come from that. So we'll sign off for now. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, and yeah, we'll talk to everyone soon. Bye bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.